All right.
Hello, everybody. John Flanders here. I'm talking tonight to my nephew, Isaac Bissell, who is quite quite well versed in agricultural issues and is also a fairly good representative of the millennial generation. As we discuss, as I've been trying to do this whole pandemic situation, what's going on in the United States. So, starting out here, Isaac, Isaac lives in Burlington, which is, of course, headquarters for the Sanders campaign. And Isaac, could you comment on what the reaction has been in Burlington to the Sanders endorsement of Biden withdrawal from the campaign, first of all?
Yeah, well, I mean, I run in activist circles, and so there's a lot of people that are already really engaged with third parties, and so people are pretty upset, I would say, just sort of sad. It just feels like the same shit that happened last time. Really, really weak candidate, getting all the establishment support. As far as Bernie endorsing him, I think people expected that. He said he was going to be doing that, so I don't think that's so much of a shock. I think in Vermont, people are going to probably, like the people that I know, are going to vote third party. It's not a swing state, so it's not really even a hard decision for like the real activist types. So I don't know. It just feels like the same shit all over again. I think people feel like Biden's just incredibly weak. Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous.
I've heard a young friend told me that the Vermont Progressive Party is looking to go national. Have you heard anything about that? Have you picked up anything on that?
Yeah, I got an organizing or an invite to just today actually to get involved in some sort of activist thing. I was actually just seeing it like 20 minutes ago, so that sounds familiar. I have to look more closely at the invite. I had to answer some questions to get into the group, but it sounds like they want to organize a national third party.
And you've also been involved in the Extinction Rebellion protest as well, right? I mean, how are they regarding this whole pandemic situation?
I think there's a little bit of a at a loss. That Extinction Rebellion is really based on like disruptive mass actions, and so there was a lot of organizing that was going into things like Earth Day and then beyond Earth Day for this, spring and summer, and it pretty much ground to a halt. It seems like most people are involved with more than just Extinction Rebellion, and so there's like a lot of movement towards mutual aid, and Extinction Rebellion still meets, both in local groups and statewide, at least in Vermont, online, just like a lot of other groups are doing on Zoom. But it seems like most of the actual organizing energy is moving towards mutual aid. And so we have people in Extinction Rebellion Burlington that are also involved in things like Food Not Bombs, and they're distributing food and just things that people need to around Burlington. So that seems like where most of the organizing energy has gone in general, and that's sort of across activist groups from what I've seen, not just Extinction Rebellion.
Okay, well, speaking of mutual aid, and I mean, food, of course, is a big portion of the whole mutual aid situation. This is an area that you've been very interested in for a long time, as I understand it. And could you talk a little bit about what your thoughts are in the whole food situation in the United States and what you've been up to recently?
Yeah, well, I work for a conservation organization, and so I do the Champlain Valley, and so it's mostly farms, and it's mostly giant, or well, not giant for the U.S., but big for Vermont, dairies. And they're having a terrible time right now. The milk price, I think, fell like $10 per hundredweight, which is almost 50% of what they were getting. And they were in a terrible financial situation to begin with. And so, they're desperate. They need to get bailed out. I'm sure they will to some extent. but farms are going out of business left and right. They're getting snapped up by the biggest operations. It's just a terrible situation. It's, they're having to dump out milk currently, and that's just something that it's sort of an ongoing thing in general. It happens to some extent, but it's just not really producing the food that we need, and it's polluting our soils. And so it's an interesting time. I'm feeling like there could be a shift, away from it pretty quickly if there was the political will. It's a good investment, and the farmers are going out of business anyway. And so I get really frustrated because it feels like even in the conservation world, we work in lockstep with the status quo. And there's just such an opportunity to shift away at a time when farmers are just really doing terrible anyway. But yeah, no, it's from a climate angle, it's really necessary. The way that we're producing food now just isn't going to work in the future when the climate's so much more erratic. And so we need to think about what kind of systems are going to be resilient in the face of really serious challenges. And we need to start moving in that direction really quickly. It seems like a good time to do it anyway, since the farms are all failing. So it seems like a huge opportunity.
Speaking of mutual aid, I mean, where are people getting the food that they're trying to distribute, and what's the situation there? I mean, milk is being dumped. I know dairy is big in Vermont, but I mean, are there any, is part of the thinking about mutual aid doing the kind of thing you've been doing in terms of gardening, gardens and permaculture and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I understand that people are buying seeds like crazy. I think right now they're just getting the food through donations from people, and locally the farmers that have produce and things like that, they can't keep a hold of it. They're doing great. And so veggie operators, especially people that are doing CSAs, things like that, I think their sales have really gone up a lot. And so I think that the food that is getting distributed through mutual aid is just food that's purchased and then donated to the people that are distributing it. I don't think it's coming from local farms. I understand that there's some value added producers that have a lot of leftover cheese, and I think that's getting distributed to the food shelves. It's sort of interesting. There's some farms that rely heavily on restaurants, and they're sort of really desperate to find markets right now and trying to figure out what do they do, what are these new avenues to market, and it's just really challenging. Then there's the CSAs, which have so many.
Would you define a CSA?
Yeah, consumer supported agriculture. So it's like you buy in the fall or in the winter a share for a weekly basket, and regardless of whether or not the farm is able to produce that, you've paid it in advance. So you're taking some of the risk if there's crop failures. And then you get a weekly basket. So you're coming to the farm and getting a week of like 8 things from the farmer. And so those type of operations are seeing a lot more business because they already are used to having that consumer interface. And so they're able to get products online really quickly and set up curbside delivery. And so they're often looking for extra produce because they can't keep a hold of it. It's just flying off the shelves because people are avoiding the grocery store. And so there's this sort of like, there's the dairy that's getting hammered, and then there's the veggie operators who are doing well and adding product and being more of like a food hub. And so there's a question as to whether that sort of food hub model is going to be durable, and whether farms should start shifting, what they're growing and how much they're growing, or whether, it's going to be until this crisis is wound down to some extent, people will go back to their normal buying patterns, and people just don't know. So there's some confusion as to how to do crop planning right now.
So Isaac, one of the things I'm interested in is what you've learned yourself from trying to grow food you were growing chickens and things, as I understand it. What do you think you've learned from your own efforts in a community, kind of a community garden setup? Is that correct?
Yeah, I did community gardening for a few years. I managed a community garden, and then I tried to do a little market gardening, just doing lettuce and that kind of a thing, and trying to get that out to people that I knew. Um, what I've learned is that it's quite a lot of work to grow food, and that scale is really important, and having systems in place and planning. It's just really challenging. Um, yeah, it's really challenging to try to figure out when you didn't grow up doing it. You don't know, you're going to want this much of this at this time. It's just a really hard thing to do. There's a lot to learn. It's not just growing the food, but then it's harvesting it and storing it, and all of those things have their own processes that you need to get right, or your harvest is at risk. And so it's a really steep learning curve, and that's sort of what I'm learning. It's not like you could just decide that this year you're gonna try to grow a lot of food. There's just so much that goes wrong. It's very challenging. That's sort of what I've learned.
And of course, as you pointed out earlier, the whole restaurant thing has really thrown a monkey wrench into the food distribution system, because so many farmers were producing for restaurants.
Yeah, for sure. Doing specialty crops. Yeah, a lot of farms are really reliant, a lot of value added producers are really reliant on restaurants. I know a bunch of cheese businesses lost a lot of their business. And so it's interesting to think about how we would actually, if we were going to try to grow food to feed the population here, what would that take? And I think that we've got to start thinking about that, because realistically speaking, we're not growing that much food for people. I mean, 80% of what we grow in Vermont is corn for cows. And so we couldn't feed ourselves right now with the way that we're using our land. And what would that look like? I think we've really started, everywhere has to start to get serious about how you can produce your food locally.
Have you broken down how we think of Vermont as an agricultural state? I mean, I realize it's mostly dairy, but has it been broken down into, how much food Vermont has to import to feed its population?
I'm sure that someone has that number. I'm sure it's got to be incredible. We've got maybe 100,000 acres in corn, and that's 80% of the land. So you figure, you've got another 20,000 acres in something else, but that's probably includes hay. And so, how much food are we actually producing? Not that much. I think that there's a lot of land that isn't as productive as it could be. And it's interesting when you think about what you'd need to do. It would be an incredible shift. And people would have to be growing food themselves too, just in their yards to a certain extent. That space would have to get used. I mean, I think the shift would be incredible.
And what kind of unemployment is there going on in Vermont? I mean, what have you
It's
noticed?
really bad. Yeah, I see what people post. My coworkers, their family members are losing jobs. So I know that there's one house that had 4 income earning people in it, and there's only one person still working. The losses are across the board, and I think I suspect that many of them aren't going to bounce back too quickly. Yeah, I think there's a lot of nonprofits in Vermont, and people working for nonprofits. I think there's going to be cutbacks for sure. I mean, I work for a nonprofit. We've kept everyone on board so far, but how we move forward. I think, we're expecting to lose 25% of our revenue. And so, I think it's really across the board. I think it's people are really struggling.
But your nonprofit is about preserving farmland, correct? Or am I wrong on that?
Yeah. Farm and forest. What I do is all farms, but we do forest work as well. But we're probably going to lose half of the money for farms this coming year. But it's unclear. And maybe that'll survive budget cuts at the state, but it seems like probably there will be some cuts. And so, we had projects that we were counting on getting funded that won't get funded.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that strikes you that you want to take up? I'm looking at my notes here. Well, the climate issue. Where do you think the climate issue fits in all of this? I mean, clearly it does, but we're unprepared for a climate change as we are for a pandemic, I think.
Yeah, I think that the thing that it's changed my thinking about climate the most is just that it's really helping me to wrap my head around how quickly things can change. Not, it's just bad things can happen, and then your life gets turned on its head. And so often when you're reading this stuff about climate change, it's just hard to imagine like living in that world. It just doesn't seem real. It doesn't seem like it, it's just hard to wrap your head around how bad it's going to get. And so it's really helped me to realize that, we're really going to be living in that future. And we need to get ready for it. It's so easy to just keep plodding along like you have been, and just be disillusioned, but not really prepare. And so we really need to start preparing for the future that's going to exist. And the society that we have just isn't going to function in that future. And so we can wait for it to crumble and, watch that play out, or we can really start to get to work in trying to figure out how we move forward. And so I feel, yeah.
Do you think that your friends of your generation have come to grips with that at this point, or are people still thinking that, well, somehow we're going to get back to normal and have an election and
I think it depends. I think it depends. I think a lot of people are sort of wrapping their heads around. I don't know. There are people that have wrapped their heads around climate change. I feel like there's a lot of people that haven't, or are in that place of it's going to happen in the future, but they don't really understand just how devastating it could be, and how rapidly things can deteriorate. So I would say mostly people don't have their head wrapped around it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when all of a sudden you don't have a job and have no prospect of getting a job, that must be a bit of a jolt. I mean,
yes,
it's hard to process. I'm older and retired, and maybe I'll get my pension check, and maybe I won't. But it's not a question so much for me as somebody with years ahead of them.
Yeah, I think people are definitely being more openly disillusioned with capitalism. I've seen that coming from people that I don't expect recently. So I'll be curious to see what kind of ways that people are shifting their thinking. I think right now it's really unclear to me how that's going to play out. You'd like to think that people are going to be really thinking about the world differently, but it's just hard to say.
Yeah. Well, as I think I might have asked you this before, but anyway, well, do you have anything else you want to say before we wrap this up? Any other comments?
No, I think
you want to cover?
No, I think that's all I got.
Thanks a lot for talking to me, Isaac. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, John.
And good
Yeah,
luck
that's good.
up there in your,
Thanks. Yeah, you too.
okay.